how the First World War shaped the modern world. We have our entire firmament here, and we might as well come in and sit down, beginning in opposite order: John Horn, Eugene Rogan, Christopher Capozzulla, H.W. Brands, Heather Perry, and Philip Jenkins. Join me in welcoming our speakers. In this panel, it's going to be really free-floating. It's going to be questions from the audience. I thought I would start off to let you think about your questions by asking a simple one about nationalism and national identity. How does the First World War really change national identity and nationalism from each of your points of view in the way it affects today? How is our sense of nationalism and national identity in each part of the world changed by the experience of World War I? Let's begin here, and we'll move down that way to John.
I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I think the largest changes are not necessarily in national identity, they're in religious and cultural identity. I would say, for example, that the aftermath of the war was the creation of these totalitarian movements which built on so many of these apocalyptic expectations I talked about, and they, in this sense, communism, fascism, Nazism, and the effects of those by the 1940s were to discredit so many ideas of European nationalism and to move towards more of a united European ideal. I think the most important changes are actually in religious identity, and I can talk about those later, but I don't want to monopolize the issue right now.
Thank you. Does one other person want to take that? Well, I guess we'll try to confine 2 responses to each question. That way we'll move along more quickly. Yes, Eugene, let me, excuse me.
Well, nationalism in the Middle East in the First World War is such a hot topic because it was such a polarizing conflict and played on people's loyalties in ways that was tearing the Ottoman world apart without the people in the empire itself having the opportunity or freedom to debate their ideas of nation and nationalism in an open way to have some say in their own future. It really comes out in the Paris Peace Conference, where virtually everybody in the Tower of Babel came down the stairs with their agenda to try and argue their case to the great powers in Paris. I talked about San Remo. Every lobbying group from Armenia, Zionists, Greek Catholics, Maronites, Syrianists, Libanists, Iraqists, everybody with their own agenda, and yet nobody having had the time to build a critical mass of support. The severance of the Arab world from the Turks was so advanced by the experience of the war itself. When you read Kemal Ataturk's memoirs of the Gallipoli campaign, he was very disenchanted with the performance of Arab Ottoman troops on the Gallipoli front. It was as though they weren't convinced they were fighting for their own homeland. And of course, for the Arabs, they weren't. They didn't speak this language. They didn't know that land. But it gave many in Turkey the sense that the Arabs were less committed to the Ottoman Empire than Turks, and nothing bore that out more than the outbreak of the Arab Revolt, which seemed to signal the height of disloyalty. Again, in modern Turkey today, it's such a shock to me to talk to contemporary Turks who will reflect back on the Arab Revolt of 1916, 1918, and say what traitors the Arabs are in the present tense. So I think it unleashed the whole panoply of national questions without resolving any of them, but made the Middle East a deeply contested spot for nationalisms as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to the audience here. And please address the person who you'd like to answer your question, if you would, at least first. Yes, sir, in the back.
I was wondering about what happened to the Kurds in this. This has been an issue ever since World War I, and they basically got cut out of the whole picture. I'm addressing Dr. Rogan, by the way. What happened to them, and why were they totally cut out of that process?
Try and be brief to give my fellow panelists a chance to share the platform here. The Kurds of all the different national groups in the Ottoman Empire were the least developed as a separatist national group by the time of the First World War. They actually were highly assimilated within the Ottoman Empire as Sunni Muslims. They played a full role in all the institutions of state. I have a student who's just finished a great doctorate on the emergence of Kurdish identity in the lead up to the First World War, and it was really in a very nascent moment and not at all separatist. No claims there to create a separate Kurdistan. So how surprising to find that when the Ottoman Empire is delivered its peace treaty through the Paris process, and you find in the Treaty of Sèvres the provision not just for the creation of an Armenian state in northeastern Anatolia, but to its south, on the southern flank of this Armenian autonomous zone, a Kurdish autonomous zone with all of the architecture for that Kurdish zone to declare statehood and independence from Turkey as well. It was not requested by the Kurds in the course of the war as a demand. It did not reflect any pre-existing nationalist movement. And one can only assume that this was one of the buffer state creating projects that had driven the peacemakers to think about how to stabilize that volatile region after the First World War. But as we were to learn, the Kurdish, as the Armenian state, was not to happen because all that territory would be conquered by the Kemalist movement based in Ankara in the course of the Turkish War of Independence. But really the emergence of Kurdish claims that today represent the greatest challenge to the San Remo borders that we know as the modern Middle East was not at all a national force at work in 1918 or 1920, but it certainly is today. And if there's any force that I see challenging the frontiers of the state system of the Middle East as it stands today, it's not ISIS or the Islamic State movement, it is Kurdish national aspirations.
Let's take it in the front, and then we'll go to you in the back.
Do I need to repeat that? Okay. We've touched a little bit on the Zionist movement, and from my understanding, limited understanding, the Dreyfus Affair was a major spur for the Zionist movement. But could you talk a little bit about the history or the size of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century?
Thank you very much. You're very right that for Theodor Herzl, Viennese journalist, covering the story of French anti-Semitism around the Dreyfus Affair had really engendered a conviction that he and many other European Jews shared, that there was no solution to the Jewish question through assimilation, and that the Jews were being treated as an entity apart from all other European communities, so they should have their own national movement. And this will give rise to the Zionist movement, which by the time you come to the First World War, I couldn't give you an express figure, how big that movement had grown. I'm guided here by the work of Israeli historian Tom Segev, who in his book, One Palestine Complete, plays on just how small and weak the Zionist movement actually was. And that if it was a strong force in shaping British wartime policies towards Zionism and Palestine, it was because they were able to manipulate a long-standing anti-Semitic belief that the Jews represented a kind of clandestine international that controlled government and economy of the world. And that people didn't see Weizmann for what he was, which was the spokesman of a marginal political movement who had a suitcase full of documents under his bed in a bedsit in Piccadilly. but not the great shaker and mover of world affairs. So, that would suggest to me that this was not a movement that commanded mass support, even at the time that Weizmann was so successful in gaining access to British political leaders and gaining their support for the movement. But it's worth remembering that even the Zionists were fence-sitters. They weren't sure whether Britain or Germany would best advance their interests, and in the course of the war had been playing the field the same way that all weak powers did, unsure who was going to prevail in the Great War, and trying to decide, which cart to hitch your horse to.
Philip Jenkins.
I wonder if I could just add something to that. By 1914, Zionism, in a sense, is in a mess, and in that there's a huge amount of disagreement. Many prominent Jews in leading Western countries oppose Zionism because they think it could lead to a future segregation of Jews in their country. Also, Zionists are very much divided as to whether they would accept a Jewish national home in another country, such as Argentina, for example, which is seriously discussed. German Jews particularly enter the war very, very enthusiastic, and there's a crucial event in 1916, which is often forgotten, which is the surging anti-Semitism in Germany in the war. In 1916, the German War Ministry announces there's going to be a census of Jews to try and decide how many of them are properly fighting at the front as opposed to shirking their duties. And this is called the Jewish census, the Judenzahlung. And that does a terrific job of persuading even very, very loyal German Jews that they have to look outside Germany. And that's what turns many people to Zionism. And meanwhile, on the other side, the fact that the British are occupying Palestine puts Palestine back on the Zionist agenda. So it's very specifically events of the First World War that shape Zionism as we know it in later years.
Dr. Brand, Ho Chi Minh went to Paris, and he wanted to speak to Woodrow Wilson about his concerns. Would you address that, and if there's any possible application to today's problems in the Middle East?
I will try to explain what Wilson's motives and intentions were at Paris, but I'll preface it by saying, I suggested at lunch that I might touch on the question of why Woodrow Wilson has become unpopular of late, and why he's a very hot topic at universities like Princeton that have honored Wilson in the past. And the basic complaint against Wilson these days is that he was the president who presided over the segregation of the federal workforce in the United States. And the explanation that I'll make of that is, well, first of all, if anybody decides to hold that against Wilson, that's fine. You can hold anything you want against any historical character. But it's important to remember that a president in Wilson's position, elected at the time he was elected, by the means he was elected, was in no position to resist the wishes of the Southern conservatives who made up a sizable portion of the Democratic Party. Wilson was a Democrat. He was the only Democrat between Grover Cleveland and Franklin Roosevelt. So Wilson understood that to hold his coalition together, he needed to hold the support of conservative Southern Democrats, who in those days basically were all white supremacists of one form or another. So this is why Wilson refused to oppose the segregation of the workforce in the United States. It also explains Wilson's approach to various groups at Paris who wanted an explicit statement that race would not be an issue. The Japanese, for example, wanted a clear statement from the victors that basically the Japanese race would not be held against them. And Wilson refused to entertain that because Wilson understood that getting any treaty that came out of the Paris Peace Conference through the U.S. Senate was going to be difficult. And if it addressed the issue of race, then he could basically kiss goodbye the chance of getting those Southern conservatives who wouldn't let him take any different position on race in the United States. So I'm not sure exactly how much of this entered into his treatment of Ho Chi Minh, but this is by Paris Wilson had essentially given up on the idea of any kind of comprehensive self-determination. If it meant that it would antagonize the British and the French more than they were already skeptical of Wilson and his internationalist schemes, then he would leave that for another day. So Wilson, by certainly the end of the Paris Peace Conference, believed that he had to get a League of Nations, and he had to get something that was at least marginally acceptable to the U.S. Senate, which by this time was controlled by the Republicans anyway.
Yeah, if I can just add a couple of thoughts on this really interesting exchange. Of course, Ho Chi Minh famously was already in Paris. He was a waiter there, and he famously borrowed a dinner suit in order to try to see Wilson when he was working at the Ritz. And there's an important point behind that, which is a topic that we haven't touched on, is the extraordinary mobility of populations produced, paradoxically, by this static war. And that, of course, included hundreds of thousands of colonial men coming for the first time to Europe. And in the French context, of course, that included Indo-Chinese, but there were also 140,000 Chinese who came and labored on the Western Front. And I think that underlines the point. And it was a question I would have for you, Professor Brands, I mean, as to whether Wilson ever envisage those ideas of self-determination applying to non-white peoples. In other words, this was a solution which was for Europe. And in a sense, you could argue, if you want to take a long sweep at it, that the springtime of the peoples in 1848 in Europe finally comes home in 1920. That's to say, when movements for national liberation and national self-determination are by and large realized with all of the problems that that entails. But this is a Europe of nation states which emerges out of the First World War. And the claims which are being made by largely secular, and this is where I come back to the very, very interesting paper this morning on religion, and I'm thoroughly in agreement with the argument that religion framed much of the language of sacrifice in the First World War, but it shouldn't perhaps also maybe blind us to the fact that there is a secular nationalism which is pushing through and which is particularly strong in colonial intellectual elites. And these are the people who beat a path, as Erez Manela has shown us in his work. They beat a path, Egyptians, Chinese, Indians, to Paris in 1919, looking for the application of these principles to the colonies. It doesn't happen then. When it happens, of course, is over a quarter of a century later with decolonization after the Second World War. So it's nation states confirmed in Europe, beyond Europe. In fact, it's the first awakening of the demands which were awakened in 1848 in Europe, which were only finally achieved really about 30 years later after the Second World War. Just one final point on this. There's an alternative, as Arno Meyer, in that Princeton historian, in his famous work on Lenin and Wilson showed, 50 years ago almost now, but a work which in a way has still stood the test of time. There was an alternative framework to all of this, which is the Bolsheviks, having failed to achieve the world revolution which they'd wanted by 1920, do realize that the colonial sphere in which Wilson and the Allies have now failed, there's been an Egyptian revolt in Egypt in 1919, there's been the Amritsar massacre in India, that they now, as Bolsheviks, argue that colonial self-liberation is part of the plan for class revolution. And they do that at the second Congress of the Comintern, the Third International, in August 1920. And again, talking about the present, I mean, right through to the end of the Cold War, the Wilsonian, the final sort of Wilsonian post-Second World War vision for the post-colonial world is shadowed by the Leninist vision, which is there right the way through the Cold War.
Did you want to say something? No. Okay, let's go right to Philip Jenkins. You had something to say on this.
Short comment. I agree with every word you say, particularly about what becomes of the ideology of sacrifice. But what's interesting is the interplay between an ideology formed in religious circles that then becomes secularized. And the great example of that, when these people come to Europe, often they meet old established European revolutionaries, and often they meet Irish revolutionaries. And if you look at the rhetoric, for instance, of the 1916 Easter Rising and that of Pierce, it is literally soaked in the blood of sacrifice. It's an utterly Catholic derived rhetoric in so many ways, but yet it lends itself and is adopted by those revolutionary movements from cultures that have never known a Catholic. And that's an interesting transition because, as you say, revolutionaries meet each other in London, meet each other in Paris, and they learn from these older established movements. So I entirely agree with your point.
Great. Okay, Kevin Butterfield, please. Then you're next.
Today is a wonderful exercise in thinking about the memory of the war, not just the physical consequences, but also how we remember it. And I think this is a question for Professor Perry. I'm struck by the consequences and the challenges of remembering a losing effort. And I'm curious about the German memory of the First World War. I wonder if you could talk about it in the near term and the rise of Nazism, the kind of short-term memory of the war, but maybe also tell us a little bit about the centennial observance and how Germans are thinking about the war 100 years on.
Well, I guess I would say a few things. So we have a tendency, I think, to kind of interpret and understand the German loss of the war as being a kind of one-way path to Nazism. And I would encourage us actually, and here maybe I'll speak as a German historian and less as a medical historian, I would encourage us actually to kind of separate the loss of the war from the German Revolution of 1918-1919, because those are two things that are kind of happening at the same time. So there's the loss of the war, but there's also this profound revolution in Germany, and a deeply democratic revolution that on the one hand is sort of part of this wave of leftist revolutions. There's a fear that it might sort of go in the way that the Russian did. But on the other hand, there are groups of Germans that are really embracing Wilson's ideas, expecting actually to be invited to the table, right? They're the ones who are not actually invited to be a part of the peace negotiations. And so I think that one thing that German historians are doing is trying to untangle the Treaty of Versailles as having sown this sort of deep-seated hatred, to disentangle that from a sense of what democracy failed to provide Germans, and the way in which Germans became, by 1929, certainly after the hyperinflation of the early 20s, and then the Great Depression, how there was a sense that this democracy, which they had embraced as part of believing Wilson and his project, and then found that they weren't treated as fairly as they expected to be, and that the 20s is a large disappointment, which is one reason why Nazis, on the one hand, but also on the other extreme side, the communists, they're both groups which, if nothing else, promise to get rid of democracy, which is very appealing to a lot of Germans in the early 30s. It seemed to be something intransigent. So I would say that first I would kind of encourage us to do. Another thing I would suggest, and probably really for all nations, is that this was a war in which there was a profound sense that the citizen soldier deserved compensation, and the sacrifice that the soldier had done was tied deeply to citizenship. And therefore, I think there was a difficulty in Germany to figure out how to celebrate and honor soldiers who had bravely defended, really to the bitter end in some cases, their nation, but on the other hand had lost. And that's where this difficulty is kind of interesting. The combining of veteran care and benefits with the civilian disabled was in some ways a kind of victory for the civilians. But in fact, by the mid-20s, many German soldiers felt as though they were losing their special pride of place, and that they were being kind of lost in Weimar. And it's one of the reasons why Hitler, his appeal to the veterans of the First World War was something that was so wildly popular among them, including Jewish veterans. And so there were a lot of German Jews who were deeply, deeply assimilated and very, very loyal to the empire and to the nation. And the Judenzahlung didn't deter them. And in fact, the numbers proved that there was a disproportionate amount of Jews in the army, fighting for the emperor. So in fact, the whole thing sort of backfired, right, in some ways, right?
Well, except they never issued the results.
They didn't publicly. They didn't
Right.
because the results, because
Right.
the results didn't prove what they had hoped the
Exactly.
results would prove, right? So there's that. And then I think, and I'm sure that John will talk more about this, but in terms of remembering the war, there's been this sort of broad movement across Europe to remember the war as a sacrifice for all, a war in which nobody won. There have been some that have argued that Germans haven't been celebrating and commemorating the war as much as others have, but I think it's also been part of this shift in the memory of the war, not to think of it so much in terms of victors and vanquished, but perhaps social and cultural winners and losers. I'll say one more thing and then I'll move on. I would like or challenge us to think about this as well as not just a kind of national emancipation or revolution, but in fact the emancipation of other kinds of social subalterns, and specifically I'm thinking about women and the way that women make citizenship gains, and also African Americans in the United States. This is a huge movement for them, and so I would think that we want to move beyond just the national paradigm here when we think about what are the deep and very important social legacies of the war.
Okay, we had our next question here. Then I'm going to go back to you. And there was a lady, yes, right there. And then we'll come back to you, and that'll take us to 4.
Heather led a very good discussion today on the health aspects of war. Having spent an intensive bit of my career of more than 50 years in ophthalmology, I would want to focus in on that, either the Germans or in general, because it's a war that causes a pointed attention by all those who have something to say, and therefore the war that results in blindness and injury to eyes is a focal point for the beginning of much of our care.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think that, as I said, kind of one of the legacies or the way that we like to interpret wars in the advancements of medical care, and that's very important, but also that these soldiers, through their suffering, deserved better medical care than had been available, and that's really sort of across the board. I don't think that's nation-specific. And therefore, much of the medical community, I think, was spurred to make medical advancement, and that is quite significant. I mean, the medical legacy of this war is huge.
John Horn, you have...
Just add a word on that. I'm not, like Heather, a specialist on medical history and the disabled, but I have worked with a number of medics on the history of war, and what strikes me, especially when I look at contemporary forms of wound, physical wound, is that once you have mechanized firepower, which you have with a machine gun, and once you have high explosive shells, which you have from the 1880s on, then you have the essential ingredient, certainly when you add flame and gas, and of course both of those things are present on the battlefields of the First World War, you have the essential ingredients of death and bodily devastation for the 20th century. Which means that the kind of wounds that soldiers face in Iraq or in Afghanistan are actually very, very similar to those that they faced in the First World War. The differences come in the kind of treatment that you can give them, but even there it's interesting that a term like triage for working out who you can save, who you can't save, which is familiar to anybody working in an accident and emergency room, it comes from the French army in 1914 and from their military services. Who can we save? Who can we leave to later? Who do we need to operate on now? And as far as I can see, the only current injury, which wasn't there in the First World War, is that of being blown up from underneath by a landmine. There were mines, but they were much bigger things. But the anti-personnel mine is a more recent invention, so that's a particularly nasty consequence of more recent wars. But otherwise, it seems to me that in terms of the kind of injury, the First World War is unfortunately the beginning of a world which is still ours.
Yes, in the back there.
For Dr. Perry, you touched this morning on the orthopedic work on the people that lost limbs and using the people in the economy and in the workforce of Germany. And you mentioned that at some point the able-bodied began to kind of resent the jobs that these people were getting. Is there any connection between that resentment and the Nazi program of eliminating the physically disabled?
I think that there is, but I don't think it's as quite as direct as we might want it to be. So part of what I think happens is that there is a kind of rhetoric about the usefulness of the body to the state, the person to the state in this war, in particular in Germany, where they're mobilized much more efficiently and maximized in a way that just doesn't occur in the other nations. The other nations just don't have the manpower pressures that Germany has. And there is this sense that anyone who is not sacrificing and doing their bit in all ways is somehow treasonous. And this includes, women cut their hair so that they could donate it to stuffed blankets. I mean, there's all ways in which the body's transformed to show this sort of sacrifice of the war. So I think what happens is that through these rhetorical strategies, Germans spend 4 years, a little over 4 years. Actually, if we consider the fact that the blockade is in place until Germany signs the Treaty of Versailles, so we're talking, June 1919, so really 5 years of war and sort of deprivation. In the meantime, you've got the Spanish flu going on. So there's this sense that the body, the national body, the wartime body is extraordinarily important, and that it's incumbent upon all Germans to somehow put that in the service of the nation. And they get used to hearing that and seeing that. And so when the Nazis begin their Volksgemeinschaft rhetoric, this idea that the body must contribute to the folk, then any body that can't do that is somehow traitorous, or as the Nazis call it, life unworthy of life. I do think we have to be very careful, though, because it's not as though disabled soldiers were targeted for elimination. And the physically disabled weren't, at least initially, targeted in the way that the mentally disabled were. But it certainly created this notion in German ears, in Germans' conceptions of what the state owes the citizen, that anyone who's not contributing to the state doesn't deserve state help. I really think that's what happened.
Capozzola.
So if I can follow up on that with a somewhat related story from the United States, I think one of the most important publications that comes out of the war years in the United States is an enormous 900-page catalog with the title, Defects Found in Drafted Men. That the draft brings every one of those drafted men in front of a doctor, right? And they harvest all this data. It's a progressive era understanding. We'll really understand the American body. And one of the things that they understand is the poor state of many people's health, and that poor health often maps onto who is a working class person, who is an immigrant. And this becomes fodder for the arguments of eugenics in the 1920s, and also critical information for the imposition of immigration restriction against Southern and Eastern European immigrants in 1924.
Thank you. Yes, the lady over here who had a, yes.
We address a condition today called PTSD, and I believe it was called shell shock when I was a child, several decades ago. Was there a condition similar to this recognized in the soldiers that came out of the First World War? And if so, how was it treated?
Yes, absolutely. So shell shock comes from this war. That was the British term, one of the British terms developed to try to describe this new injury. It's kind of interesting. In German, the word that they used was Seelenschock, which would translate to soul shock. And it's very interesting because those words, right, are already telling us something about the epistemology of these conditions. So if you call it shell shock, you believe that this condition is caused by shells, by this sort of external force, by being around them, by the fear, by the duress. If it's soul shock, then implicit somewhere in that definition is that there was something already wrong with the person to begin with. And that was very key because any soldier who could prove that his injury, physical or mental or nervous, that came from the war, of course, would get some kind of war pension. What's kind of interesting, though, is that one of the ways to deal with this this new condition, and actually now some historians have found that it goes back to the Civil War. It's called soldier's heart in the Civil War. But one of the things that's interesting is this talking cure, and there's a lot that's been written about Sassoon and Rivers. In Austria-Hungary, which was a multi-ethnic, multinational army, not everyone spoke the same language. And most learned men, the doctors, were Austrian German, spoke German, and many of the men, right, the rank and file, were Polish or Czech or Slovenian and didn't speak German, so they could not use a talking cure because they didn't speak the same language. So what we find in these multinational armies is that they relied more on the physical treatments that were available at the time, so a lot of shock treatment, a lot of water therapy. There's still some reliance on what was called moral therapy and this idea of sort of distracting the patient with gardening or repetitive motion to help them sort of distract from the pain. And then just outright denial, whether or not that was a real condition or whether it was a form of, well, I guess, slacking, right? A sort of form of avoiding what in Britain was called malingering, but a way of somehow trying to evade duty. So it all really depends. What's kind of interesting now, and I think it's coming out of our advancements in medical discovery, is that with the emergence of TBI, traumatic brain injury, and understanding that some mental trauma can be physically caused, right? That it's not a kind of psychological trauma, is actually causing. There's a whole group of historians in Heidelberg right now who are going back and looking at a lot of the mental trauma cases from the First World War, and they're finding that they think there is TBI, that TBI was happening, and that there were some of these cases that are caused by physical injury. So it's one of these interesting ways in which our modern day medical advancements impact the way in which historians try to understand the past.
John Horn.
Can I just add a point to that? And it just picks up, Heather, on your last comment, which is using the present to look at the past. So if you look at the figures for whatever word was used at the time for shell shock, the figures are quite low for the First World War for the reasons that you suggest. It's novel. There's the fear of malingering. People don't know how to diagnose it. In the British case, 2 to 4%. If you look at the Second World War for the US, if you look at the war in Vietnam, it's much, much higher. And so the question is, and it relates to what I was saying a moment ago about similarity of injuries, if we project that back, then that suggests that there's a significant underestimate of the number of soldiers who suffered from shell shock in the First World War. That for many it simply didn't come to the surface. The second point related to that, I was thinking when you were speaking this morning, we tend to keep these in separate categories, but I find it hard to believe that men who've lost, an arm or lost their genitals, who've been blown up, aren't also mentally shocked. So the question of post-traumatic stress syndrome as an accompaniment of physical wounds, I think is perhaps also an issue that's worth looking at.
Yes, there was one more person up here, and then we'll take new. Yes, was that you? Yes, please.
In 2014, I was fortunate enough to go to Vienna and also to Berlin. The Austrian Military Museum located in Vienna had a spectacular exhibit on World War I. I was so impressed when I left it, I had to just sit down and think about it. It was almost as if they were inventing a new weapon, a more efficient weapon, every week to wreak more and more carnage. The exhibit in Berlin and the History of the German People Museum was much more subdued. And I found it very interesting that the comments on the exhibits basically said, we didn't lose the war, the Allies didn't defeat us, we just simply got tired of fighting. The people forced the Kaiser quit right now. That wasn't my question, though, that I'm going to ask. The Shia and the Sunnis are certainly at each other's throats at the present time, and I think are basically at the cause of many of the problems in the Mideast. What were the conditions between the two prior to World War II, or I'm sorry, prior to World War I and after World War I? Would it have been better, rather than having geographical nationalistic borders drawn, to have separated the two into different areas and allowed them to make their decisions?
Does this one fall to the Middle East hand again? It's an excellent question. One of the things I discovered in doing my research on the campaign in Mesopotamia was the breakdown in support among Shiite Sunnis in Iraq for the war effort, which took the following form. They got drafted along with Sunnis. All Ottomans got called to arms, but they deserted in great numbers, particularly as the British were scoring key victories from Basra and making their way up both rivers of Mesopotamia. And when they found that the war wasn't to their liking, they would go back to their towns. And the Ottomans sent recruiting gangs to try and get these deserters to come back to service. And they were all faced the threat of death for having deserted. But of course, the Ottomans didn't need executions, they needed soldiers. And when they would go to these Shiite shrine towns in the middle Euphrates, they faced massive resistance, and they set off a series of revolts. So actually, starting quite early, the Ottomans were trying to control their Shiite population to keep them from revolting over the way in which conscription was being carried out. At the same time that they were trying to defend their territory against the British, it made it doubly remarkable that they were able to stop the British at Salman Pak and retain the territory as long as they did. I think that the British observed this. One of the things that the British wanted to do was play on Shiite and Sunni differences. Lawrence of Arabia, even before going to Arabia, was sent on a fool's mission with Aubrey Herbert at the very end of the siege of Kut to try and either provoke a mutiny, an Arab revolt in Mesopotamia, long before the Hashemite Arab revolt, or failing that, to bribe an Ottoman general to let the British soldiers go. And he was given £1 million that he had discretion over to try and achieve this. This is all in the biographies and stuff. It's not sort of woven yarns. This is the way it worked out. And there are nice Arab accounts of Shiites that he met with to try and be recruited to this lost cause of an internal revolt against the Ottomans. And they make an interesting addition to the record. Where do we stand with that? The Ottomans had ruled over Mesopotamia as though it were a Sunni territory, and they imposed a culture of Sunni domination that became the inheritance of the successive state, Iraq. I think, despite that had anyone tried to separate out let's say, Baghdad as a Sunni area from the rest of Iraq as a Shiite area, would have run into difficulties that are present today, which is the intermixing of communities is so extensive that they don't lend themselves to separation without ethnic cleansing. And I think there was real problems with the way that the British went about map making, but I don't know that Iraq was actually one of them. And what was really the problem between Sunnis and Shiites, let's say, in the beginning of the 20th century is very different from what it's emerged to be in the 21st century, which has so much more to do with the way that religion has become a dominant principle of government since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and the way in which majority rule came to Iraq after the American invasion in 2003, that has unbalanced the regional balance of powers and made religion and politics, Sunni and Shia, now battle lines. But in my own lifetime, I've known it to have been otherwise. The Beirut that I grew up in, a kid in the 1970s, Sunnis and Shias intermarried. They were very vague on the differences between their respective interpretations of Islam. Something's changed in the Arab world. It has a lot to do with the way that religion has gone into politics. And I think it's going to be much harder to fix than simply by trying to separate people out.
Yes. We've got time for a few more questions. We'll start here. Then we'll go to you. Okay. Please, right up here in the front, Amanda Tomlinson. Right here in the front. Amanda is a star Arabic student. She was selected by the UN out of thousands to present to the General Assembly her essay in Arabic.
Assume it's February 1st, 2017, and each of you has been invited into the White House for a private meeting with the president, the new president. And you have an opportunity to jab at him or her with your finger or pound the desk. Is there something you'd want to see done or not done during the next 4 years? As a private citizen, I look at you as an expert in the Middle East. And I get my opinions from news cycle to news cycle. And so one thing that I hear politicians arguing is, well, why don't we arm the Kurds? But I understand the Turks don't want the Kurds armed because they're afraid of the Kurds' ambition for a separate homeland. And so if I hear that the Kurds are being armed, is that good news? Are we winning? I mean, is peace eventually coming to the Mideast, or is things going worse? What do you want the president to do or not do?
Okay. I would start by saying, be very careful about getting any more deeply involved in the Middle East. I wouldn't rule it out categorically. There are things that can happen. American nationals can be directly threatened, injured. But as a general rule, the United States has been trying to bring peace to the Middle East for the better part of a generation and hasn't done a very good job. So I would say, don't get any more deeply involved than we already are.
This is specifically not a comment about your question about the Kurds, but if I was talking to the president at that point, I would remind him or her that in terms of the most severe and dangerous situations possibly facing the US, the Middle East is like number 3 or 4. And I would urge them to pay very, very close attention to what is happening in China and what is happening in Russia, and way down the agenda, I would think about the Middle East, because the situations with China and Russia are deeply scary and deeply frightening, and the fact that they're not being talked about more scares me.
Yes, Eugene.
I don't think I'm going to get much applause for this one. But it's probably since you've got a group of experts and you want to pick our brains, good to get some different opinions too. And when Madam President wants a selection of views, it's good to get a selection of views. All I would say is I look across the Middle East today as a region so shattered, so broken, that America will not long be able to overlook it until its interests are more directly involved. And it's better to address a problem in constructive ways than to try and fix things that are destructive. I think we learned through hard lessons how not handling simmering problems can come home to sting you. What I would like to see America using, though, far more than its military force, is its economic force and its values. Not to promote democracy, that didn't bring us much joy, but certainly to think about reconstruction plans, not just to do good in the world, but to make the world a place with which we can trade, that will stop producing people who are alienated and estranged from world order. I would like to see America take a leadership role in helping to rebuild a Middle East that every time I see it on the news is just of cities that have been bombed into rubble. And as long as they stay rubble, they'll be a source of instability to our world, of refugees and of terrorism. But if we can help them to rebuild and give people a stake in a future that is better than the rubble that they're facing now, I feel America has a kind of Marshall Plan moment where it could do some very genuine good in the world. So,
Thank you.
I just want to say one thing too. I won't try to project or anticipate foreign policy, but I would just like to say about our veterans, if I had the ear of the president, I would say, can we stop, take stock, and invest some serious money and time into thinking about how we're taking care of the veterans of this war, right? We have too many who are homeless and who are struggling and who are just being marginalized because everyone's sick of these wars, and they deserve more attention for their sacrifices. That's what I would do.
John?
I think my first response would be you're asking the wrong people, because historians by definition always come too late. But if I did have the privilege of talking to Madam President, and I was asked what single lesson from the First World War, its origins, its course, could one draw some kind of knowledge and insight from, it would simply be this, which I think is for me the lesson that historians have for people with power, people in politics, which is that nothing ever turns out exactly as planned.
yes.
Thank you. Yes.
Ken, I'd like to introduce you all to a book. This goes back to your medical, in fact, talking about the veterans, it's appropriate here because this is a book that came out when we lived in South Carolina. It's called Mance, not a house a Presbyterian minister lives in. That was the man's name, Mance Jolly. I cannot recall the author's name, although I met the man. It's a story of a young man who fought in the Civil War in South Carolina and was essentially shell-shocked, or I liked your, what was the first term that you used, not the soul shock, the other term?
From the Civil War, they're starting to call it soldier's heart. Soldier's heart?
I didn't hear. I'm sorry.
Soldier's heart is the term they're finding now.
Right, that was one of the things, but there was another one that you used before, the soul shock. It was a German translation, I think. Anyway, it doesn't matter. This was a young man who fought in the Civil War as a Confederate, and he was injured, but not visually, not anyway physically, in an attack when his companions were all killed. He had no scratch on him. He came away with nothing that seemed to be a problem, and yet he began to act very much as a PTSD patient would act. Later on, years later, he became a vigilante, was with one of the raiders in South Carolina, attacking anybody that looked like a Yankee, and which was a lot of folks. And he ended up marrying a young woman who was very good for him. He followed her and her father to a ranch in Texas, and it was there that he began to have these flashbacks, although he did not remember them at the time. Ultimately, it caused him to inadvertently drown himself because he thought he was chasing Yankee soldiers. And he took himself and his horse into a river. Now, it's all conjecture in some ways because nobody knows what was in the man's mind. But the author was able to extrapolate from his behaviors and what people told about him how he was affected by the battle. And it might be something that anybody that is dealing with medicine and injuries during any war for that matter, would be able to enjoy the story. Well, enjoy is the wrong word. Anyway, the name is Mance. The young man was Mance Jolly, like Jolly, happy Christmas and all. And I just wanted to introduce you to that because it's affected me a lot in knowing what these people have gone through. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to another question. Yes, here.
Okay, I had about 4 or 5 questions now that's gone over to the last one. I lived in Lebanon and in Jordan and in Ethiopia here just past while, and I would say in response to what you were saying about taking perhaps a more active role in terms of economically, I also see a warning in that because I've seen, since I was in Jordan in 2001 and then thereafter, and there's just a lot of investment in private schools. You see the School of Mines, the School of America, and the curriculum oftentimes has American flags, American presidents in it. It's for an upper class kind of clientele. They have hiking, biking projects, kind of American kind of projects that they're trying to bring into Jordan specifically. And then I saw in Ethiopia as well, these private schools that people go to, that there is a coercive influence on traditional life that is produced by that. I was with some Bedouin people in Jordan, and they and taxi drivers and whatnot. There's a depressive, oppressive feeling when you start showering people with these economic goodies from America that is resented. And that causes a split off in its own right of resistance towards that, colonial or whatever term you want to use. That I think that's something to be considered, and perhaps you might want to comment on that. Yeah.
If I could comment on that, I'd just like to say that the United States has spent many billions of dollars in Afghanistan since 2001 with not much to show for it. Marshall Plans are proposed for various places. Marshall Plan for Vietnam, Marshall Plan for Latin America. But the thing that made the Marshall Plan work was that Europe had this pre-existing, call it sort of legal and intellectual infrastructure, and what it needed after World War II was the material resources to get that up and going. For some of the places we're talking about now, that infrastructure, they have never been developed in the sense that Europe was developed during the 1920s and 1930s. So it's an entirely different matter. It's sort of economic development from the ground up, rather than kickstarting a pre-existing situation.
I would just add to that, they also had the state institutions and structures for distributing those resources through democratic processes, whereas sort of pouring large amounts of resources into corrupt or failed states can often sort of generate tensions and exacerbate existing tensions. But I guess back to the broader sense, I think, to the extent that Americans have provided humanitarian aid to other countries, that's a history that traces in many ways to the First World War, to the efforts of Americans to address the crisis in Belgium, which generated the political hero of the war, Herbert Hoover. Right? Notice almost every other war in American history created a military president. The First World War created a humanitarian president. We forget that part of it because of what happened to him once he got into office. But when that humanitarian impulse is a crucial aspect of what Americans could do, and I think this is what Professor Rogan was getting at, but I think might require both being sort of humble about our impulses and humble about how transformative it could be. Right? And I think so. Maybe Marshall Plan was the wrong term.
It's a shorthand. We talk about using development funds to take war-broken countries and put them back into operation. And so there is no other Marshall Plan than the one that happened after the Second World War, but we use it as a shorthand. And I think there is no way that America will be able to assume the bill for reconstructing what's been destroyed in the Middle East. It's going to take an international effort. It's going to take leadership. And I think that there is money that could be diverted to that. We've spent a great deal of money in making war. We've spent a lot of money in destroying. So I think that there is a moral responsibility to spend money on helping to rebuild and to encourage others to do so. And I think that America is very well placed to do that. But I totally take the point that were America to go in and try and make major investments and try and impose schools, and it would seem in some way as if it were trying to extend its influence or authority, and that would certainly backfire. I think that the extent to which America could be seen to be doing disinterested good, its efforts will be very well accepted. And we are looking at a region, as you move across from Libya through Syria and Iraq and Yemen, that is so broken, with such limited resources to rebuild it, that if we don't take the self-interest of rebuilding this territory, we will find that it will come home to haunt us. And I'd rather see us be proactive, diminish the amount of bombing we do, and spend what is much cheaper, the money on bricks and mortar to help people have homes to go back to, and then start talking about reforms or renegotiating the politics of that region.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. I promised this gentleman here, and then we'll come to you, and then we're going to go to a lady here if we have a time for a 3rd question.
There's quite a body of work coming out of the German trenches of World War I and post-World War in Germany that was decidedly anti-war. So that, to my estimation, there was an anti-war movement that doesn't get much discussion. So the question to you as history professors and knowledgeable people, what happened to that anti-war movement and how did it impact or not impact the post-World War I Germany?
Germany specifically. Well, there was a profound pacifist movement that came out, particularly among artists and intellectuals. The most famous, of course, we know is All Quiet on the Western Front, but we can also look at the series of art produced by soldier artists such as Gross or Dix. Those are very important. I could maybe suggest a couple of things. A lot of that stuff came out the art was coming out in the early 20s. All Quiet comes out in 27, I think. And first and foremost, one of the first things the Nazis did when they came to power was to label all of that as degenerate and anti-German, and burn it and ban it and make it next to impossible for a lot of Germans to find after 1935. However, there was actually a larger international peace movement and concerted efforts among many, especially in the wake of the League of Nations. And Germany, of course, disarms, mostly because they're forced to by the terms of the treaty. Everyone else was supposed to. There was supposed to be this kind of voluntary disarmament, or at least sort of descaling of armament, and it, for the most part, didn't happen. And I think that there was a real disappointment among people. So I could just start there, but I could go on.
Well, I would just add, though, that the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 was the most successful disarmament conference ever held. And it diminished the size of the navies, of the principal naval powers. So that was one area in which this anti-war or disarmament movement succeeded.
I would add a second, which is actually the efforts to ban the use of chemical weapons, and that was an effort that was a bottom-up effort by the peoples of many nations, right? I think less and often resisted by some of the states that wanted to hold on to them, and that movement, which the United States, was not in a hurry to sign. Nevertheless, I think created international norms against the use of chemical and biological weapons that continue even into the crisis in Syria in the 21st century.
Can I just add one thing? The United States, in some ways, has the strongest anti-war reaction to the First World War. And where you see it is in the 1930s, it really becomes a mass movement where you get so many legislators who are struggling to prevent any chance of the US ever getting involved in war again. And there's a very interesting movement, which I think has been largely forgotten, which is called the Veterans of Future Wars. and it saying, well, you know, give us our money now before we have to get killed. And that becomes a very strong movement. But when you look at FDR dealing with the menaces of Japan and Germany, he has to wrestle through the thicket of legislation that has been created by that very strong anti-war movement, which reaches its height in about 34 and 36, which in some ways disables the US from intervening on the side of the Allies.
And in fact, this was an explicit congressional reaction against Woodrow Wilson, who took the United States into war after proclaiming neutrality. The neutrality legislation of the mid-1930s says this is out of the hands of the president. Congress is going to take over, and no president is going to lead us into another European war the way Wilson led us in the First World War.
Yeah. I mean, just to say that I think it's an excellent question, and I think there is a profound movement of revulsion against war, and it doesn't always, in some cases it does carry a capital P, pacifism, but there's a kind of pacifist sensibility which is much more widespread after the First World War. You can see it during the war itself, because the question is this, and soldiers pose it to themselves: is the real enemy the enemy opposite, or is the enemy the war that we're all facing? And it's a question which, in a sense, you can't really afford to answer while the war is still going on. But after the war is over, you can. And I think that, while the importance of Woodrow Wilson and all that we heard about at lunchtime, I think, is very considerable, but we shouldn't make the mistake of imagining that the League of Nations project is just a Wilsonian project. It's not. It fits into a whole long tradition of European liberal thinking about international relations and socialist thinking about international relations. And in the 1920s and around the League of Nations, which because of the American absence becomes largely, but not exclusively, a European organization, there is a whole strong movement for peace and what in other contexts I've called cultural demobilization. In other words, it's how you dismantle the image of the enemy. And that work is profound in the interwar years. And I'll just give you two examples of it. One is that there are movements of the kind that you say, veterans movements. Moral disarmament is one that comes out of this. And the idea is that unless you disarm the mind, then it serves no purpose to disarm actual weapons. You have to make people think in terms of peace. The other is that hard-nosed statesmen like Aristide Briand as French foreign minister and Gustav Stresemann, the German foreign minister, between 1925 and 1929, engage in this cultural disarmament. They agree that Germany and France will not go to war again. There's an extraordinary moment when the German delegation finally takes its seat in 1926 at the League of Nations, and they're welcomed by Aristide Briand. And Aristide Briand says, and he's talking about martial masculinity here, he says, we've nothing left that we need to prove to each other on the field of battle. So it's time to throw away these widow's weeds. And of course, it makes us remember that women were walking around covered in black widow's mourning veils for the entire interwar period, in their millions. And he says, and it's a wonderful image, he says, in future, and it's exactly to your description of the Wilsonian project, he says, rather than fighting each other when we have the inevitable disagreements, we shall go like a peaceful country folk to the local magistrate to settle our differences. Now, Briand is a hard-nosed politician, just like Kellogg is a hard-nosed politician and signs the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So I guess what I'm saying is that there is a profound movement, a sentiment in favor of peace and reconciliation in the interwar years, which inheres in the League of Nations. And by the way, one of its manifestations is the first project proposed by Aristide Briand for a United States of Europe, which is his 1928-1929 proposal. We know that in Zara Steiner, the historian who's written a wonderful book called The Lights That Failed, we know that these lights failed when the Nazis came to power, and an alternative understanding of war, which was you never demobilize and you remobilize when they, as it were, held sway. But I think it shouldn't blind us to the fact that there is this profound moment and movement in favor of peace in the interwar years, and then it picks up in different forms in the post-World War II period. And that's, in one sense, why I think the European project, for all the difficulties it faces at the moment, we can see as a kind of an indirect godchild of this moment after the First World War.
Just one very counterintuitive thing. We all talk about the First World War, and we assume, oh, well, that must have been invented after the Second World War. No. The first great history of the First World War is published in 1920 with a despairing sense of, well, that's the first, and let's wait for the next.
And maybe I'll just add on to that. Another one of our common assumptions is that the war ends in 1918. Because the thing, of course, that we're not talking about are the way in which violence continues until 21, 22, 23, 24, and most of these, whether it's the Anglo-Irish War, whether it's the what my grad student writing on Greece calls the Greco-Turkish War, whether it's about the Russian Civil War, whether it's about the revolutionary violence going on in Germany, what's going on in Hungary, what's going on in Poland. War continues until 24 is a good time to sort of stop it. And even then, I mean, I think we have to sort of think about what's going on internally for these nations. They were not at peace.
But if I can just add to that, I mean, I think that's true. And in a book, the book which I did with Robert Gavart on War and Peace, we coined the term the Greater War to talk about this continuation of violence, and paramilitary violence, revolutionary violence, counter-revolutionary violence, which I think you're quite right, it goes on until 1923. But thereafter, there's a moment, a period, quite an extended period of real peacemaking. I mean, I live in Ireland. You know, we had the Belfast Peace Agreement in 1998. It took 10 years for the essential fruits of that to develop. So why would we think that after the Great War that the Paris Peace Conference and the various treaties would actually be the beginning of the peacemaking? In a way, they were the culmination of the war. And what we have thereafter are a series of revisionist moves, the first of which is the Treaty of Lausanne, which is when the Turks get away with tearing up the Treaty of Sèvres. And by the way, Hitler is a keen observer, and German nationalists more generally, of that moment. But on the other side, there's the feeling, well, the real peacemaking, the real peace process is actually going to come from the Locarno treaties in the mid-1920s. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. All we know about transitional justice, about transition from war to peace, suggests that these are long and difficult processes. And so I think it's slightly illusory to imagine that there could ever have been a kind of transition from war to peace in 1919.
On that note, on the note of peace, I'm going to shut down this conversation that is so exciting. We could go on all night. Please join me in thanking our guests for a wonderful, wonderful dialogue.